apparently it had been raining, and he had on a Union rain system poncho, if you will. And he told these two soldiers, the soldiers were picking cherries. He walked up to me, rode up to these two guys, and he said, "Gentlemen, you're my prisoners." And he had this 44 caliber pistol under that poncho, and he said, "You make a noise and I'll blow your brains out." So he took them, put them in front of him, and the three of them were riding down a road, and along comes a column of Union cavalry that had to be a quarter of a mile long. He said, "Boys, you say one word, and next minute you're going to be in heaven." And so these two prisoners, who could have, all they had to do was say, "Mosby," and that would have been it. They kept their mouths shut, and he told them to turn left, and they turned left, and that was it. They were prisoners. There was another time, right after he became free to operate on his own. This was in January of 1863, that he started going after, he asked Stuart, again because he could not stand normal soldier life. And in the winter, as many of you know, the armies went into what were called winter quarters because the roads were so nasty and could not support heavy wagons and cannons and all this marching around. Because the roads were so muddy and absolutely hideous, the armies basically settled down and built semi-permanent quarters over the course of the winter. And there they camped and threw snowballs at each other and just did some marching and cleaning their weapons and blah, blah, blah. And of course, Mosby, being a squirrely little guy, couldn't stand that. And he asked Stuart one night, Jeb Stuart, who was his immediate supervisor, if he could have a few men. And Stuart basically, I think, was annoyed with him and said, "All right, take 9 men. Just take 9 men. Go ahead." So Mosby got most of, all these guys were from the 1st Virginia Cavalry, which is where the unit in which he served at that time. And he began going out and harassing the outer ring of security for Washington, which was a cavalry screen. And if you can imagine, there was a Washington in the center here, and around that were a series of about 90 forts. And around that were tens of thousands of infantry, and outside of that were thousands of cavalry. So there were these concentric circles around Washington that were protecting the capital city. So Mosby's job was to find out a little bit about the cavalry, what they were doing, where they were, what their strength was, this kind of thing. And he, at night, for example, he and maybe 1 or 2 other men would go into a camp, a little campsite, where these guards or cadets, there would be 6, 8, 10 of these soldiers standing guard. They would have a fire there, and they were basically a tripwire. For if there was anybody coming through, they would, fire their weapons, and other units would be alerted to come to their aid, and so on and so forth. Well, Mosby and this 1 or 2 other men would walk into these little camps here, and at night you cannot tell blue from gray. And so Mosby would say something like, where are we? We're 5th New York, we're trying to get back to our cavalry camp in Vienna. And these soldiers would, "Oh my God, you're like 12 miles away from, where? You're way off. Oh my gosh, there's so much snow and everything here. I don't know how we're going to do this." And of course, this was in January. And of course, Mosby would say something like, "Oh, tell me, did you get a good crop in last year? Did you have a good harvest?" And, "Oh yeah, we had a good, we're from up in New Jersey, and we grow some really good crops up there. And well, have you heard from the family?" "Oh yes, my daughter's been sick, but she's fine now. She's much better. My wife seems to be doing well. And boy, I sure can't wait to get home. And friend, would you mind if I had a cup of coffee? Body sure could warm up with a cup of coffee on a cold night." Like, yes, help yourself, of course." He'd be talking along, making short chatter and whatnot. The next thing you know, Mosby would slide up next to this guy and put a 44 caliber pistol up to his temple and say, "You're my prisoner, you and everybody else here." And so the soldiers, their horses, their weapons, their equipment would disappear into the night. He did this 2 or 3 times. And the guy who was the commanding officer of that unit was called the 1st New Jersey Cavalry. It was commanded by a guy named Percy Windham. How would you like to have a name like Percy Windham? Well, Percy Wyndham was a soldier of fortune. He was actually a knight. He'd been knighted in England and had become a soldier of fortune. Percy Wyndham came from the old school, the Napoleonic school, where his idea of manly combat was to have people at 50 yards and they'd stand there and just blast each other until nobody was left standing. And he considered Mosby's operation of taking these prisoners at night without firing a shot as unmanly, wussy. And he called Mosby a bushwhacker and a horse thief. Not only did he say that, but he said it to a reporter who printed those words. And when Mosby read the words, he said, I'm going to get this guy. I'm going to get him. I'm going to get Percy Wyndham for doing that. Those soldiers would have uniforms on, they had weapons just like I did. They could, if they had captured me, they could have, I would have been their prisoner just like any time in warfare. I'm going to get Percy Wyndham. So found out where he was. His office, or his headquarters, was in Fairfax Courthouse. Mosby decided he was going into Fairfax Courthouse. Of course, now, never mind that there were 8,000 Union soldiers around the city. He had 29 men, and they met on the night of March 8, 1863. And one of those men was a federal deserter from the 5th New York Cavalry, just by chance, who had been stationed at Fairfax Courthouse. The man was named James Ames, who had been a sergeant of the 5th New York Cavalry, and when Abraham Lincoln declared his intention to free the slaves after the Battle of Sharpsburg in 1862, Ames said, no, told his mates, I joined the army to save the Union, not free the slaves. So he takes his pair of pistols and his horse and leaves, deserts, finds his way to Mosby, and frankly, he told Mosby a story, and Mosby thought, yeah, okay, sure, so now you want to be one of us. And so Mosby sends him to his first fight without a weapon. Because if he'd been armed, think about it, he could have killed Mosby and, hey, you're a hero. So anyway, Ames distinguishes himself in battle. And so now all of a sudden he's okay, he's one of us. And so it is Ames who leads the 29 men in the last quarter mile under the cannons because he knows the countersign of the cavalry screen, the cavalry guard there. They go into town, first thing he does, cuts the telegraph wires. He sends about 8 of his men into the officer's stable to get some good horses. He and about 3 men walk into the telegraph tent, and he says to this kid who's sitting there with a pistol up to his temple, he says, where's Percy Wyndham? Sir, he's gone tonight. He's in Washington. Oh yeah? Well, who else is in town? Well, there's General Stoughton.